On the morning of August 7th, 1945, 3 senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Army gathered in a concrete bunker beneath Tokyo to examine photographs that shouldn't exist, images of a city that had been erased from the earth by a single bomb. What they were about to discover would shatter not just their understanding of warfare, but their entire conception of what was possible in the modern age. The secure communications room at the Imperial General Headquarters, buried 17 meters beneath the Ichigaya district of Tokyo, maintained a constant temperature of exactly 18 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season above. Colonel Takeshi Yoshida had been stationed in this windowless facility for 9 months, coordinating intelligence reports from Japan's rapidly shrinking defensive perimeter. He had become accustomed to bad news, the loss of territories, the destruction of naval assets, the systematic obliteration of industrial cities by American B-29 firebombing raids. But the message that arrived via military telegraph at 0847 hours on August 7, 1945, was unlike anything that had crossed his desk in 4 years of war. Hiroshima. Complete communications blackout. All radio stations silent. No reports from ground observers. Railroad dispatch confirms inbound trains halted 15 kilometers from city center. Engineers report unknown obstruction. Visibility 0 due to dust clouds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yoshida read the telegraph 3 times, searching for the operational details that should have accompanied such a report. Raid size, aircraft type, number of bombs dropped, estimated casualties. The message contained none of this information, just silence where an entire city had been. Major General Seizo Arisue arrived at the bunker 20 minutes later, summoned from his residence by urgent courier. As head of Imperial Army Intelligence, Arisue had access to classified reports from every theater of operation. He had read decoded American communications, analyzed captured documents, and maintained extensive files on enemy capabilities. At 53 years old, with 3 decades of military service, he prided himself on anticipating threats before they materialized. The Hiroshima report presented no clear threat to anticipate, just an absence of information that grew more disturbing the longer he studied it. "Have we received reconnaissance photographs?" Arisue asked, spreading the telegraph message on the situation table that dominated the center of the operations room. "Weather reconnaissance aircraft departed Iwakuni Air Base 40 minutes ago," Yoshida replied, checking his logbook. "Pilot is Captain Mitsuhiro Hashimoto. He should reach Hiroshima airspace within the hour." They waited in the communications room as morning stretched into afternoon, surrounded by maps that showed the shrinking boundaries of Japanese-controlled territory. Okinawa had fallen 3 months earlier. American forces now sat just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, preparing for an invasion that intelligence estimates suggested would begin in November. The loss of another city, even one as strategically significant as Hiroshima, was terrible but comprehensible within the framework of modern warfare. The reconnaissance photographs arrived via motorcycle courier at 1,415 hours, still damp from the darkroom chemicals. Captain Hashimoto had made 3 passes over Hiroshima at varying altitudes, expending all available film to document what he had found, or rather, what he had failed to find. Arisue spread the first photograph under the overhead lights. The image showed a landscape that his mind struggled to process. Where Hiroshima should have been a city of 70,000 civilians, major military headquarters, significant industrial facilities, there was simply emptiness. Not the selective destruction of strategic bombing, where factories were targeted and residential areas remained relatively intact. Not even the comprehensive destruction of area firebombing, where entire districts burned, but buildings remained recognizable as structures that had once served purposes. This was erasure. The photograph captured a circle of destruction approximately 4.4 square miles in diameter, with the most severe devastation concentrated in the city center. Within this zone, every building, every street, every recognizable feature of urban infrastructure had been reduced to uniform grey rubble. The Aioi Bridge, which had spanned the Ota River as a distinctive T-shaped structure visible from high altitude, existed as a twisted metal skeleton barely distinguishable from the surrounding debris field. Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Mishima, chief of the Army's Technical Intelligence Section, joined them as they examined the subsequent photographs. Mishima had spent 2 years analyzing American aviation technology, studying captured aircraft and interrogating prisoners about enemy capabilities. He understood blast patterns, burn damage, structural collapse mechanics, the technical signatures that allowed intelligence officers to reconstruct attack methods from photographic evidence. "How many aircraft?" Mishima asked, pulling the photographs closer to study fine details through a magnifying loupe. What was the raid composition? "Initial reports suggest a single aircraft," Yoshida said carefully, aware of how impossible that sounded. Weather observers tracked 3 B-29 seconds approaching from the south at 0815 hours. 2 aircraft departed the area immediately after passing over the city. The third aircraft remained on station for approximately 2 minutes, then departed on a westerly heading. Mishima looked up from the photographs, his expression carefully neutral. 3 aircraft total, and the city is gone. It wasn't a question, more an attempt to reconcile observation with possibility. The conventional wisdom of strategic bombing, developed through years of combat operations in Europe and the Pacific, held clear mathematical relationships between cause and effect. A standard American firebombing raid on a Japanese city required 300 to 500 B-29 bombers carrying incendiary payloads totaling approximately 2,000 tons. The resulting conflagration would consume wooden residential structures across several square miles, killing thousands through fire and smoke inhalation. Hiroshima showed destruction exceeding anything previously documented, accomplished by 3 aircraft that hadn't even needed to penetrate the city's airspace in formation. "There must be reconnaissance errors," Arisue said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps the photographs document cumulative damage from multiple raids. Previous attacks we failed to track properly." But Mishima was already shaking his head, pulling forward additional photographs from different angles. "Look at the blast pattern. Radial distribution from a single point of origin. Every structure within the central zone collapsed outward, away from a fixed epicenter located approximately here." He tapped the photograph where the Ioi Bridge had been. "This is single-point detonation, not area saturation bombing." The 3 officers stood in silence, studying photographs that violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare. Modern military doctrine held that destroying a city required massive application of industrial resources, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of bombs, complex logistics chains supporting sustained operations. Individual weapons, regardless of sophistication, possessed limited destructive capacity constrained by the amount of explosive material that could be delivered to target. Hiroshima suggested that doctrine was wrong. Over the following hours, additional intelligence arrived in fragments that gradually constructed a coherent timeline of the attack. American radio broadcasts, monitored by signal intelligence, mentioned Hiroshima explicitly, using language that suggested something unprecedented had occurred. President Truman's statement, decoded and translated by 1800 hours, contained phrases that made no immediate sense. Atomic bomb, harnessing the basic power of the universe, force from which the sun draws its power. Scientific terminology divorced from recognizable weapons technology. Dr. Yoshio Nishina arrived at Imperial headquarters at 2130 hours, summoned from his laboratory at the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research in Tokyo. At 55 years old, Nishina was Japan's preeminent nuclear physicist, one of only a handful of scientists in the country who understood theoretical atomic research. He had studied in Europe during the 1920 seconds, working alongside Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, and had returned to Japan with knowledge of atomic structure that existed at the extreme frontier of human understanding. Arisue briefed him on the Hiroshima photographs and the intercepted American radio broadcasts, watching the physicist's expression shift from professional curiosity to something approaching horror. "Show me the blast pattern analysis," Nishina said quietly. They spread the reconnaissance photographs across the situation table, overlaid with Mishima's calculations of destruction radius and estimated explosive force. The central zone, within 1 mile of the detonation point, showed complete structural collapse. Buildings had been crushed by overpressure that must have exceeded 20 pounds per square inch, the threshold at which reinforced concrete structures fail catastrophically. Wooden residential construction had simply ceased to exist, converted to splinters driven outward by a shockwave moving faster than sound. Secondary zone damage extended to approximately 2.2 miles from the epicenter. Structures remained standing but showed severe damage, roofs torn away, walls collapsed, window frames blown inward. The thermal effects in this zone had been intense enough to ignite all combustible materials, creating secondary fires that had merged into a firestorm, consuming everything the initial blast had damaged but not destroyed. Nishina performed calculations on a notepad, his pencil moving steadily through mathematical formulas that Arisue couldn't follow. The physicist's hands remained perfectly steady, but his breathing had become shallow and controlled the physiological response of a man confronting information he had hoped never to encounter. The explosive yield, Nishina said finally, would need to be equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT to produce this destruction radius, 15 kilotons. He looked up from his calculations, meeting Arisue's eyes directly. That is not possible with conventional explosives. The largest conventional bombs used in this war carry perhaps 5 tons of high explosive. To achieve 15 kilotons would require 3,000 such bombs detonated simultaneously at a single point. Then what created this? Mishima asked, gesturing at the photographs that documented impossible destruction. Nuclear fission, Nishina replied, the words carrying weight beyond their simple syllables. The Americans have successfully weaponized atomic energy. The explanation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, as Nishina outlined theoretical physics that existed at the absolute edge of scientific understanding. Matter, he explained, was not solid in the way everyday experience suggested. At atomic scales, matter consisted of energy bound together by forces humanity was only beginning to comprehend. Under specific circumstances that required industrial capabilities and scientific knowledge that Japan had never seriously attempted to develop, those atomic bonds could be broken. The energy released when uranium-235 underwent rapid fission was millions of times greater than the energy released by chemical explosives. A single kilogram of fissionable material, properly weaponized, could produce an explosion equivalent to 17,000 tons of TNT. Hiroshima had been destroyed by physics, not conventional warfare. The implications cascaded through strategic assumptions like shockwaves through a condemned structure. If America possessed atomic weapons, and the evidence from Hiroshima made that conclusion inescapable, then traditional military calculations about invasion, defense, and acceptable casualties had become meaningless. A nation capable of erasing cities with single bombs didn't need to mount amphibious assaults, didn't need to fight street-by-street battles through metropolitan areas defended by soldiers willing to die rather than surrender. America could simply destroy Japanese cities one by one, systematically erasing urban centers until nothing remained worth defending. How many? Arisue asked, the question encompassing everything that mattered about Japan's immediate future. How many of these weapons do they possess? Nishina spread his hands in a gesture of helpless uncertainty. I cannot know. The industrial requirements for producing fissionable material are immense. Uranium enrichment requires facilities consuming massive amounts of electrical power. Plutonium production requires nuclear reactors operating continuously for months, but America has industrial capacity beyond any nation in human history. If they have built one atomic bomb, they likely have more. The overnight watch in the communications bunker stretched into the early hours of August 8th as the 3 officers compiled a preliminary assessment for presentation to the Imperial General Staff. The document they produced, carefully worded to avoid appearing defeatist, outlined facts that couldn't be softened. Japan faced an enemy wielding weapons against which there was no defense. Conventional military doctrine offered no counter-strategy. Dispersing forces and resources wouldn't help. Atomic bombs didn't require specific targets. Hardening military installations was irrelevant when a single weapon could vaporize reinforced concrete bunkers. Japanese determination to fight to the last man became strategically meaningless when the enemy didn't need to set foot on Japanese soil to achieve complete victory. The report concluded with a single recommendation, phrased as carefully as possible. Immediate diplomatic initiatives should be undertaken to establish acceptable terms of surrender before additional atomic weapons are deployed. At 0358 hours on August 8th, as they prepared to deliver their assessment to the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, Yoshida received an urgent telegraph from Miyazaki Prefecture. Soviet forces had crossed the Manchurian border 4 hours earlier, violating the neutrality pact that had protected Japan's northern flank. The Soviet invasion involved 1.5 million troops, 5,500 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft forces that overwhelmed Japanese defenders who had expected at least token warning before hostilities commenced. Japan now faced atomic annihilation from the east and conventional invasion from the north simultaneously. The strategic situation had become untenable, though Arisue knew that recognizing this fact was different from accepting it. Japanese military culture held surrender as incomprehensible dishonor. Soldiers were trained from childhood that death was preferable to capitulation. 4 years of war had reinforced these beliefs through countless examples of men choosing suicide over survival as prisoners. Convincing Japan's military leadership to surrender would require overcoming cultural assumptions that ran deeper than tactical considerations. The presentation to the Supreme Council occurred at 1,100 hours on August 8th in the secure conference room adjacent to the Emperor's quarters in the Imperial Palace. 6 men attended. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, War Minister Korechika Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa, Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda. Arisue laid out the intelligence findings with clinical precision, avoiding emotional language while allowing the facts to speak for themselves. The reconnaissance photographs circulated around the conference table, each official studying images that seemed impossible despite being demonstrably real. The intercepted American broadcasts were read aloud, translated carefully to preserve the original phrasing that emphasized unprecedented technical achievement. A single bomb, War Minister Anami repeated slowly, staring at the photograph showing Hiroshima's obliteration. You are certain only one weapon did this? Weather observers tracked 3 aircraft, Arisue confirmed. 2 departed immediately. Only 1 released ordnance. The destruction pattern is consistent with single-point detonation of extraordinary magnitude. Foreign Minister Togo had been arguing for negotiated surrender since Germany's collapse in May. He seized on the atomic bomb intelligence as validation of arguments that had been repeatedly rejected by military officials who insisted continued resistance was possible. We cannot defend against this, Togo said flatly. Our cities can be destroyed one by one without risk to American forces. Continuing the war is suicide. But War Minister Anami pushed back with arguments grounded in military tradition. Intelligence can be mistaken. Photographs can be staged. Perhaps the Americans have developed one experimental weapon and are attempting psychological warfare to force surrender without invasion. It was a rational argument, based on precedent. Armies throughout history had exaggerated their capabilities to achieve strategic advantage through deception. But the argument collapsed under the weight of evidence that continued accumulating throughout the day. At 1,458 hours, as the Supreme Council debate entered its 4th hour without resolution, Yoshida received an emergency telegraph from Kokura. Multiple B-29 aircraft approaching from south, heading north-northeast. Weather clear. The American bomber stream that had haunted Japanese cities for 18 months was returning. Standard procedure would be to track the formation, identify the target city, and issue civil defense alerts. But nothing about August 8th followed standard procedure. Arisue stood by the situation map, marking the projected flight path with red pins as updated position reports arrived every few minutes. The bomber formation actually just 2 B-29 seconds, though ground observers continued reporting multiple aircraft due to distance and altitude passed over Kokura without releasing weapons, then altered course toward Nagasaki. The second atomic bomb detonated at 1,102 hours local time on August 9th, destroying the northern industrial valley of Nagasaki and killing an estimated 40,000 people instantly. The explosion was visible from observation posts 60 miles away as a flash of light that momentarily outshone the sun, followed by a mushroom-shaped cloud that rose 60,000 feet into the stratosphere. News of Nagasaki reached Imperial headquarters at 1,320 hours. The Supreme Council reconvened in emergency session 30 minutes later. There could be no more debate about whether atomic weapons represented psychological warfare or experimental technology that America possessed in limited quantities. 2 cities had been destroyed in 3 days. If this pattern continued, Japan would lose urban centers at a rate that made conventional military resistance meaningless. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Imperial Palace maintained traditions of architectural restraint that stretched back centuries, wooden floors that announced footsteps with deliberate creaks, paper screens that filtered sunlight into soft illumination, gardens visible through, open corridors that reminded occupants of nature's permanence beyond human conflict. Emperor Hirohito's private study occupied the northeast corner of the palace's inner compound, a modest room by the standards of absolute monarchs, furnished with a desk, bookshelves containing European scientific texts, and a single photograph of his father, Emperor Taisho. It was in this room, at 21:40 hours on August 9th, that the emperor made a decision no Japanese ruler had made in the nation's 2,600-year history. He would personally intervene in a deadlocked government council to impose surrender. Prime Minister Suzuki had requested the unprecedented imperial conference after the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War spent 11 hours debating surrender terms without reaching consensus. The military faction, led by War Minister Anami and Army Chief of Staff Umezu, insisted on conditions that would preserve Japan's political structure, prevent occupation of the home islands, allow Japanese forces to conduct their own disarmament, and guarantee no war crimes prosecutions. They argued that accepting unconditional surrender would mean the end of Japan as a sovereign nation, that American occupation would destroy the imperial system, execute military leaders, and reduce Japan to colonial status. The diplomatic faction, led by Foreign Minister Togo and supported reluctantly by Navy Minister Yonai, countered that Japan possessed no leverage to demand conditions. 2 atomic bombs had been used. American broadcasts suggested more were available. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria had eliminated Japan's last hope of negotiated peace through Moscow's mediation. Continuing the war meant watching Japanese cities disappear one by one until nothing remained. Emperor Hirohito had been receiving intelligence briefings throughout the crisis, reading the reconnaissance photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the careful attention of a man trained in marine biology who understood that accurate observation preceded all valid conclusions. He had studied the casualty estimates, 70,000 dead at Hiroshima, 40,000 at Nagasaki, with numbers climbing as radiation sickness revealed itself in survivors. He had read translated excerpts from President Truman's statements about atomic weapons, noting the clinical language that described city-destroying bombs as if they were conventional military assets rather than fundamental violations of warfare's established boundaries. The emperor understood what some of his military advisors refused to accept. Japan had lost not just a war, but an entire technological era. The nation that had modernized with extraordinary speed during the Meiji Restoration, that had defeated Russia in 1905, that had built an empire spanning the Pacific, had been rendered strategically obsolete by physics, weaponized through industrial capabilities Japan could never match. Continuing resistance wasn't courage, it was suicide by installments. The Imperial Conference convened at 2,350 hours in the palace's underground bomb shelter, a concrete chamber designed to protect occupants from conventional explosives, but utterly useless against atomic weapons. 15 men attended, their formal dress contrasting sharply with the utilitarian surroundings. Emperor Hirohito entered last, taking his position at the head of a long table, while the others stood in respectful silence. The Supreme Council cannot reach agreement, Prime Minister Suzuki began, his voice carefully controlled. I have taken the extraordinary step of requesting Your Majesty's personal judgment on the question of surrender terms. War Minister Anami spoke immediately, presenting the military position with conviction that hadn't wavered despite Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The American demand for unconditional surrender threatens the imperial system itself. We cannot accept terms that might lead to Your Majesty's prosecution as a war criminal. We cannot allow foreign occupation, forces to control Japanese territory. We cannot permit enemies to disarm our military forces. These conditions are intolerable. Anami continued for 20 minutes, outlining strategic possibilities that remained available if Japan refused surrender. The Ketsugo defensive plan mobilized 2.3 million regular troops and 28 million civilian militia for final defense of the home islands. American invasion forces would face opposition that would make Okinawa's casualties appear modest. The cost of conquering Japan would be so high that America might accept negotiated peace rather than unconditional terms. And if they simply continue dropping atomic bombs? Foreign Minister Togo interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. Will patriotic determination protect our cities from weapons we cannot defend against? Intelligence suggests America possesses limited quantities, Anami countered. Their production capacity cannot support sustained atomic bombardment. We can absorb these attacks while inflicting unacceptable casualties on invasion forces. It was magical thinking disguised as strategic analysis. The assumption that American atomic capabilities were limited rested on no evidence beyond wishful hope that such terrible weapons must surely be rare. But the United States had demonstrated industrial capacity throughout the war that exceeded Japan's by orders of magnitude. American shipyards had built more aircraft carriers in 3 years than Japan possessed in total. American factories had produced more aircraft, more tanks, more of every category of military equipment than Japan could manufacture. Assuming atomic bomb production was somehow constrained when conventional weapons production had been essentially unlimited was fantasy, not analysis. Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda offered a more nuanced military perspective, acknowledging that atomic weapons had changed warfare's fundamental mathematics. We cannot win, Toyoda said bluntly, but we can make victory so costly that America accepts compromise. The Emperor system must be preserved. That single condition justifies continued resistance. The debate continued past midnight, circling arguments that had been exhausted during the Supreme Council's earlier sessions. The military faction refused to accept surrender without conditions that would preserve Japan's sovereignty and honor. The diplomatic faction insisted such conditions were unobtainable from an enemy wielding atomic weapons. No compromise existed between these positions. At 0210 hours on August 10th, Emperor Hirohito spoke for the first time since the conference began. His voice was quiet, requiring the officials to lean forward to hear clearly, but his words carried absolute authority. I have listened carefully to all arguments. The time has come to bear the unbearable. We must accept the Potsdam Declaration and end this war. The room fell into shocked silence. The Emperor had not merely broken the deadlock, he had chosen surrender over continued resistance, prioritizing preservation of his people over abstract concepts of military honor. It was a decision that violated every principle of Bushido, the warrior code that had shaped Japanese military culture for centuries. Samurai tradition held that death with honor was preferable to surrender. Soldiers were expected to fight until killed, then continue fighting as spirits. Capitulation was disgrace beyond redemption. Yet here was the emperor himself, descendant of an unbroken imperial line stretching back to mythological origins, choosing survival over honor because the alternative meant national extinction. Your Majesty, War Minister Anami began, his voice strained with emotion barely controlled. The army will never accept. The army will accept my decision, Hirohito interrupted, gentle but absolute. I cannot permit further destruction of my people. I have observed the photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have read the casualty reports. If we continue this war, Japan will be destroyed completely. The imperial line will end not through surrender, but through annihilation. The emperor continued speaking for 12 minutes, the longest statement he had made in any official capacity during his reign. He addressed each argument for continued resistance, acknowledging the pain of surrender while explaining why that pain was preferable to certain destruction. He spoke of the thousands already dead in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the millions who would die if atomic attacks continued. He referenced Japan's cultural heritage temples, artworks, historical sites that would be erased if every city became a target for weapons that left nothing standing. "My personal fate is irrelevant," Hirohito concluded. "If preserving the imperial system requires my abdication or prosecution, that is acceptable. What is unacceptable is watching Japan disappear city by city while we cling to principles of honor that mean nothing if the nation itself ceases to exist." The conference ended at 03:05 hours with imperial authorization for Japan to accept the Potsdam Declaration, subject to one condition: preservation of the emperor system. It was the minimum negotiating position the military faction would accept, and the maximum condition that had any chance of American approval. Foreign Minister Togo drafted the surrender message immediately, working through the night to produce text that balanced submission with dignity. The communication went through Swiss diplomatic channels at 07:00 hours on August 10th, reaching Washington by early afternoon American time. The Japanese government is ready to accept the terms enumerated in the joint declaration which was issued at Potsdam on July 26, 1945, with the understanding that said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. The carefully diplomatic language meant, "We surrender, but the emperor stays." The American response arrived 36 hours later, after intense debate within the Truman administration about whether to guarantee the emperor system's preservation. Secretary of State James Burns drafted language that was deliberately ambiguous. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. The phrasing suggested the emperor would remain, but, under American control, a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but provided enough ambiguity for both sides to accept. War Minister Anami read the American response at an emergency cabinet meeting on August 12th and immediately rejected it as inadequate. "Subject to the supreme commander" means the emperor becomes a puppet. This is unacceptable. We must continue fighting until America guarantees preservation of imperial sovereignty without conditions. But the momentum had shifted irreversibly towards surrender. The emperor had spoken. The diplomatic machinery had been engaged. Stepping back from negotiated peace would require rejecting imperial authority itself, an act of insubordination that even the most hardline military officers struggled to justify. The final cabinet vote occurred at 2300 hours on August 14th, after 2 more days of contentious debate. The result was not unanimous. War Minister Anami and the 2 chiefs of staff voted against acceptance, but Prime Minister Suzuki ruled that imperial will superseded cabinet consensus. Japan would surrender under the terms America had offered. Emperor Hirohito recorded the surrender announcement in the palace's radio studio, beginning at 2330 hours. The announcement, delivered in formal court Japanese that most citizens would struggle to understand, carefully avoided the word surrender. Instead, it spoke of accepting the provisions of the joint declaration and enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. The recording required multiple takes. The emperor's voice, never before broadcast to the Japanese public, cracked with emotion when describing the new and most cruel bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Technical staff later edited the recording to remove obvious mistakes, creating a final version that would be broadcast at noon on August 15th. War Minister Anami spent the evening of August 14th visiting military units around Tokyo, quietly ensuring that no officers planned unauthorized resistance after the surrender announcement. He had opposed surrender to the final moment, but once the emperor's decision became final, Anami accepted that continued military opposition would be treason against the throne itself. At 2300 hours on August 14th, after confirming that the military would not rebel against surrender, Anami returned to his official residence, changed into traditional Japanese garments, and committed seppuku ritual suicide that preserved honor while avoiding the disgrace of living in defeated Japan. He left a note stating simply, "Believing in Japan's sacred indestructibility, I apologize with my death." Approximately 500 military officers committed suicide in the 48 hours surrounding the surrender announcement. Most left notes expressing similar sentiments: profound shame at Japan's defeat, combined with loyalty to the emperor that overrode personal feelings about capitulation. The suicides represented the collision between two incompatible value systems: Bushido tradition that demanded death over surrender, and imperial authority that demanded obedience to the throne's decision, even when that decision violated every warrior principle. The surrender broadcast on August 15th reached a Japanese population already devastated by years of total war. Food rationing had reduced average caloric intake to near starvation levels. American firebombing had destroyed 66 cities, killing over 400,000 civilians and leaving millions homeless. The atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply the latest atrocities in a war that had systematically destroyed Japan's urban infrastructure. For most civilians, surrender meant relief rather than shame. The war would finally end. The bombing would stop. Children would not starve next winter when food production collapsed entirely. The intense propaganda about fighting to the last Japanese citizen had terrified millions who understood they would be the ones dying in that final defense. But for the military class that had dominated Japanese society since the Meiji Restoration, surrender represented catastrophic failure. Officers who had promised victory through spiritual superiority now faced the reality that Bushido determination meant nothing against atomic weapons. The carefully cultivated ideology of Japanese invincibility had been exposed as dangerous fantasy. Colonel Yoshida listened to the surrender broadcast in the same underground communications bunker where he had first read the telegraph about Hiroshima 8 days earlier. The emperor's voice, thin and formal through radio static, described accepting the joint declaration to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come. Grand peace. The phrase seemed almost satirical given the circumstances. Japan had surrendered after atomic weapons demonstrated that continued resistance meant national extinction. There was nothing grand about this peace, only the grim mathematics of survival. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Army Vice Chief of Staff, flew to Manila on August 19th as Japan's official representative to receive surrender instructions from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. The meeting occurred in a hot, crowded conference room where American officers outlined occupation procedures with business-like efficiency that made no allowances for Japanese sensitivities. Kawabe listened to instructions about disarming Japanese forces, establishing American military, government, arresting war crimes, suspects, and dismantling Japan's military-industrial capacity. The occupation would be comprehensive and absolute. Japan would not be treated as a defeated equal, but as a conquered enemy subject to complete American control. Your government will maintain administrative functions under supervision of Supreme Commander Allied Powers, a staff colonel explained, consulting prepared documents. All military forces will be disarmed and demobilized. Military officers above the rank of major will be removed from public service. Industrial facilities capable of military production will be dismantled or converted to civilian use. The instructions continued for 3 hours, each requirement representing another layer of control that would govern occupied Japan. War crimes trials would prosecute military leaders responsible for atrocities committed during the war. Educational reforms would eliminate militaristic indoctrination from school curricula. Constitutional reforms would establish democratic government and reduce the emperor to symbolic figurehead, without political authority. Kawabe signed documents acknowledging receipt of the occupation directives, his hand steady, despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. Japan had not simply lost a war, the nation was being fundamentally restructured by an occupying power that intended to prevent future military aggression through systematic elimination of the political, economic, and cultural structures that had enabled the Pacific War. The formal surrender ceremony occurred aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, represented the Japanese government, while General Yoshijiro Umezu represented the Imperial Armed Forces. They signed the Instrument of Surrender at 0904 hours, officially ending World War II. Shigemitsu approached the surrender table with visible difficulty. He walked with a cane due to injuries from a 1,932 terrorist attack and struggled to locate the correct signature line on the surrender document. American officials watched with varying degrees of sympathy as the Japanese foreign minister, clearly humiliated by the ceremony's deliberately theatrical staging, finally completed his signature after awkward delay. General MacArthur signed for the Allied powers, followed by representatives from the United States, China, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, Netherlands, and New Zealand. Each signature reinforced the total nature of Japan's defeat. This was not negotiated peace between equals, but unconditional surrender imposed by overwhelming force. The entire ceremony lasted 23 minutes. Overhead, 450 American carrier aircraft flew in formation, demonstrating aerial superiority that Japan could no longer challenge. The massive battleship Missouri itself, with main guns capable of hurling 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles, represented conventional military power that had become obsolete in the atomic age. Dr. Yoshio Nishina returned to his laboratory at the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research on September 5, 3 days after the surrender ceremony. American occupation forces had not yet arrived to inventory Japanese scientific facilities, giving him brief opportunity to destroy experimental apparatus and research documents related to Japan's own atomic research program. Japan had pursued nuclear weapons development since 1941, though the program never progressed beyond basic research. Nishina's team understood the theoretical physics of fission weapons, but lacked the industrial infrastructure required to produce fissionable material in weapons-grade quantities. Uranium enrichment required facilities consuming electrical power that Japan couldn't spare from military production. Plutonium production required nuclear reactors operating at scales Japan's engineering capabilities couldn't achieve. The Japanese atomic program had been fantasy from its inception, not because Japanese scientists lacked understanding of nuclear physics, but because weaponizing that understanding required industrial resources available only to nations with America's manufacturing capacity. Nishina burned research documents in the laboratory courtyard, watching years of theoretical calculations reduced to ash. The knowledge couldn't be destroyed. Nuclear physics was fundamental science accessible to any nation with sufficient resources, but the specific approaches Japan had explored need not fall into American hands. American technical intelligence teams arrived at the Institute on September 9th, led by scientists from the Manhattan Project, who had helped develop the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They examined Nishina's cyclotron, the particle accelerator that had enabled basic nuclear research, and ordered it destroyed to prevent future weapons development. Engineers demolished the cyclotron on November 24th, breaking apart the massive electromagnetic apparatus and dumping the components into Tokyo Bay. Nishina watched the destruction from his laboratory window, understanding that the order came from men who feared Japan might somehow reconstitute atomic capabilities, despite comprehensive defeat. The fear was irrational. Occupied Japan possessed no capacity for advanced weapons research, but rational or not, the cyclotron's destruction symbolized America's determination to prevent any possible resurgence of Japanese military power. Colonel Yoshida transitioned to civilian life in December 1945, removed from military service by occupation authorities, implementing policies that disbanded Japan's armed forces completely. He found work as a translator at occupation headquarters, helping American administrators navigate Japanese bureaucracy. The irony of his position was not lost on him. He had spent years coordinating intelligence about American military capabilities, analyzing their strengths, predicting their strategies. Now he helped those same Americans govern Japan, translating orders that dismantled the military system he had served for 2 decades. But the alternative to occupation was extinction. That simple fact, demonstrated conclusively by atomic weapons that had erased 2 cities, made collaboration with former enemies preferable to prideful resistance that served no strategic purpose. Major General Arisue appeared before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in April 1946, testifying about intelligence operations he had directed during the war. The tribunal, modelled on the Nuremberg trials that prosecuted Nazi war criminals, sought to hold Japanese military leaders accountable for atrocities committed throughout the Pacific Theatre. Arisue's testimony focused on intelligence failures that had contributed to Japan's defeat. He described the systematic underestimation of American industrial capacity, the inability to recognize when strategic situations had become untenable, the cultural factors that prevented realistic assessment of military prospects, even as Japan lost territory continuously from 1943 onward. We believed determination would prevail over industrial advantage, Arisue testified. We were wrong. Atomic weapons simply made our error conclusive rather than gradual. The tribunal eventually convicted 25 military and political leaders of war crimes. 7 were executed, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan during most of the Pacific War. 16 received life imprisonment. The convictions represented Allied determination to impose accountability for aggressive war and wartime atrocities. Emperor Hirohito was not prosecuted, though many Allied officials had advocated for his trial as the supreme military authority under whose reign the Pacific War had been waged. General MacArthur intervened to protect the emperor, arguing that occupation would be impossible if Japanese citizens believed their sovereign was being persecuted by foreign conquerors. The decision to preserve the emperor system proved strategically wise. Japanese citizens accepted occupation with minimal resistance, following imperial authority, even when that authority now served American interests. The alternative occupation resisted by a population that viewed the emperor's prosecution as sacrilege would have required military force that America preferred to avoid. By 1952, when the occupation officially ended and Japan regained sovereignty, the nation had been transformed completely. Democratic constitution, pacifist military policy, educational reforms, economic restructuring, every aspect of Japanese society had been reshaped by American administrators determined to prevent future militarism. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki had achieved more than Japan's surrender. They had demonstrated that warfare had entered an era where cities could be erased by single weapons, where traditional military virtues like courage and determination meant nothing against physics, weaponized through industrial power that only superpowers could command. Japan's military leaders had realized this truth in August 1945, examining photographs that showed where a city of 70,000 had been. The realization came too late to prevent the war's final catastrophes, but early enough to prevent the even greater catastrophe of continued resistance against weapons that had made conventional warfare obsolete. The emperor's decision to surrender, breaking centuries of military tradition, acknowledged a fundamental truth. Sometimes, survival requires abandoning principles that led to disaster. Japan had chosen empire over peace, military expansion over diplomatic engagement, spiritual superiority over realistic assessment of national capabilities. Those choices had led to atomic fire consuming Japanese cities. Learning from those mistakes meant accepting defeat, occupation, and transformation imposed by former enemies. It meant living with the shame of surrender while building a future where such surrender would never be necessary again. In that acceptance, perhaps, lay wisdom that military victory alone could never provide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.